Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Naturally Beautiful Shorelines, how your shoreline can protect the lakes. I think we're just about ready to get started. We're a few people still entering, but I'm sure that you'd like to get on with dinner as well, so we'll get started tonight. If you have had a chance to do our polls, we'll give you a second more to finish that up, and then show them off in the screen for everybody to see the results. My name is Deborah Martin Downs. I'll be your moderator tonight. I'm the president of the Muskoka Lakes Association, as well as a member of the Environment Committee that's putting on this webinar this evening. I'm a second generation cottager on Lake Muskoka. So Katie, do we have results of the polls at this point? Oh, there we go. So great to see so many members of the MLA here today. So 85% of you are members, and glad to see someone who wants to become a member. Thank you. Good to see that you get our e-blasts, and you can see where people have come to us through that. We've got a lot of people from Lake Muskoka, and Joseph Arasso, and it's nice to see other lakes here too. We have a lot of small lake members as well. And good to see 70% of you have a naturalized shoreline, but and a few with partially manicured as well. And then if you can see the relationship, if you have a natural shoreline and you had virtually no erosion during the floods, that's part of what you're going to hear about today. So thank you for taking those polls, and we'll be ready to get on with our program. So right now there's about 65 of us on the line, and I hope that you enjoyed this evening. So first, let me introduce our webinar topic: Naturally Beautiful Shorelines, how your shoreline can protect the lakes. So the Muskoka Lakes Association recently undertook a survey of members to inform our strategic planning process that we're in the middle of. And we asked waterfront owners to tell us what they valued about Muskoka. And the two top choices were 93% valued water quality, great for swimming, and 91% valued natural shorelines. And sometimes we refer to that as the view from the canoe. But members also expressed concerns for water quality degradation in the future, and 88% of those respondents, and an overdevelopment of the waterfront, and 85% were concerned about that as the top two choices. And I think we all have examples of waterfronts that we think are good for the lake and some that aren't. So one of my sayings is that you can't take the land out of the lake. And what I mean by that is that the land around the lake drains towards it. And therefore what happens on the land influences the water. So we wanted to explore this topic a little more and provide some education for property owners who may not be sure what the right thing to do is for our shorelines. So tonight, you're going to learn the relationship of your shoreline with the water quality and the nearshore character of your swimming areas and the view, and what you can do to protect or restore your shoreline for all its values. So let's get going. So here's what's going to happen. Each of our panelists is going to present for about 15 minutes to provide an overview of their topic area. And then we're going to have time for questions of the panel. So we'll be taking questions from the floor, also known as the Q&A box, and that's as contributed by our participants. And that Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen in the center. Each of our panelists will present, a few housekeeping rules. So first, you are all muted, and you will not be able to speak tonight or show us your COVID hair on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you do want to ask a question to the panelists, you can type it in the box, press enter to have it posted. And if you want, you can identify which panelist you would like to address it first. And sometimes there's a question in the box that you already would have asked. So you're welcome to like that question, and that will make it come up to the top so it can be answered with more people wanting that one. And if we can't get to all the questions tonight, we'll endeavor to get the answers for you and post them with the webinar on the MLA website in a few days. So, and as a reminder to all our panelists, you're going to use your mute button too when you're not speaking, and they will come on screen as they're presenting. The webinar is also being recorded so that members or others who were not able to attend will be able to listen at their leisure. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Rebecca Willison. Rebecca is the Watershed Planning Technician for the Muskoka Watershed Council and the District of Muskoka. She has a degree in zoology and a certificate in environmental conservation from the University of Guelph, as well as a certificate in restoration ecology from Niagara College. Through her work with the district and the Muskoka Watershed Council, Rebecca is active in promoting good stewardship practices across our watersheds, with an emphasis on maintaining good water quality. So Rebecca is going to be speaking about healthy shorelines and healthy lakes. And Rebecca, you're on screen, and please unmute yourself and share your screen, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Deb. Just getting my presentation going here. Excellent. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. My name is Rebecca Willison, and as Deb said, I am a watershed planning technician with the Muskoka Watershed Council and the District of Muskoka. The topic of healthy shorelines is one that I feel strongly about, and I'm hoping that by the end of my presentation today, it'll be one that you share a bit of enthusiasm for as well. It likely comes as no surprise that our shorelines are facing a lot of pressure. We want to be close to water. For many of us, it's the reason we're in Muskoka in the first place. But the shoreline area is also one of the most sensitive. Some of the challenges our shorelines are facing include increasing development pressures, increasing population density, increasing resource use, decreasing wildlife habitat, and degrading water quality. Everything we do on our waterfront property can impact the health of our shoreline and eventually our water quality. On top of all of these pressures, we also have to contend with climate change. Lakes and shorelines do not have an endless capacity to deal with the stresses we put on them. And this capacity may be further reduced as climate change continues to manifest in a variety of ways, such as rising water temperature, less ice cover, extreme weather events, and more variable lake levels. So what is a healthy shoreline property? Deb, in her introduction, made note that all the land around a lake drains into the lake. So whatever we do on land will impact our water. And really that's the entire purpose of a shoreline buffer, is to prevent what we're doing on the land to impact the water. One of the most obvious features of a healthy shoreline property is the presence of a shoreline buffer, which is a strip of vegetation that borders creeks, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. As I just mentioned, the purpose of this strip of vegetation is to buffer the impacts of our cottage and activities and keep them from impacting the water. Shoreline areas are special, and not just for us. The shoreline produces the ultimate edge effect upon which 70% of land-based animals and 90% of the aquatic plants and animals rely on. From a purely practical point of view, not even taking into account the enormous wildlife and aesthetic benefits of having a naturally vegetated shoreline, it all comes down to the flow of water on your property. Minimizing or delaying stormwater runoff from your property will control erosion and will improve the effectiveness of the natural soil and vegetation in preventing ammonia, nutrients like phosphorus, and harmful bacteria from entering the water. As you add roofs and driveways to your property, you're also adding new sources and higher volumes of stormwater runoff to be managed, and a well-vegetated shoreline becomes even more crucial. The interrelationship between a lake or river and its shoreline is important. The buffer area is the last line of defense against the forces that may otherwise destroy a healthy water body. A naturally vegetated shoreline filters runoff generated by surrounding land uses, removing harmful chemicals and nutrients. At the same time, shoreline vegetation protects the lake edges from the onslaught of erosion caused by waves and ice. The shoreline area also provides critical habitat for aquatic insects, microorganisms, fish, and other animals, thereby helping to maintain a balance in sensitive aquatic ecosystems. Unfortunately, as lake landscapes are developed, natural shorelines often are damaged or destroyed. Beneficial natural vegetation is cut, mowed, or sometimes replaced. This often leads to eroded shorelines, degraded water quality and aquatic habitat, impaired aesthetics, and in severe cases can result in a reduction in property values. While a 30-meter buffer may not be feasible on every property, the general rule of thumb is the bigger the better, but anything is better than nothing. So if you're not quite sure where to start on your property, just start little and go from there. Essentially, your buffer keeps what you do in and around your cottage from impacting your lake. The closer your cottage is to the lake, the more important it is to have a healthy shoreline buffer. When we talk about the buffer area, most people usually just think of the area where water meets land. But we're talking about more than just that strip along the waterfront. All of the zones are important, not just for water quality, but also to protect your property during extreme weather events. The upland zone is usually where your cottage is located. This area tends to be higher and drier with vegetation that takes advantage of the better drainage. The riparian zone is the transitional zone between water and land. Vegetation in this area is adapted to changing water levels and can tolerate periods of flooding. The littoral zone begins at the water's edge and extends into the water until sunlight can no longer penetrate the bottom. This is where you'll find aquatic plants as well as the aquatic organisms that form the base of the food chain. This area is the most productive habitat in the entire lake. Each zone has a variety of functions, but also works with the other zones to protect your waterfront. Altering one zone will impact not only that zone, but also the functions of the other zones as well. Through surveys conducted by the District of Muskoka on a number of lakes, we know that overall, waterfront property owners have done a good job of keeping at least a small strip of vegetation along the waterfront in the riparian zone, but that much of the upland zone around lakes has been greatly altered. In order to derive the most benefit from our shoreline buffers, we need to rethink how we manage our upland areas so that we don't lose the stormwater management functions that they provide. And that doesn't even take into account the wildlife and aesthetic benefits that a healthy shoreline provides. Greater buffer widths will increase the amount of runoff that soaks into the ground and is cooled and cleaned before reaching the lake. As we begin to realize how many different functions shorelines and buffers have, it becomes clear that it's to our advantage to protect these areas and maintain healthy shorelines. So what exactly does a healthy shoreline look like? A healthy shoreline is full of vegetation, and the more variety in the species, the better. Remember, if there's one thing nature dislikes, it's a monoculture. So the healthier shoreline increases as the number of different plants increases. A healthy shoreline will also have different levels of vegetation. Everything from ground cover and grasses and ferns to wildflowers and plants, shrubs, and different ages of trees. In addition to all of the plants, a healthy shoreline may also have standing dead trees, fallen logs, and different sizes of stones and rocks. All of these components help to create structure and habitat for wildlife. With all of these rocks and vegetation, things may look a little wild to you, but remember that nature by definition is not neat and properly trimmed. The more plants and the more structure you have, the better it is. But there's also different levels and degrees of wild. So your shoreline doesn't have to be completely impassable to be healthy. By adding narrow pathways and by trimming tree branches and shrubs instead of removing them, you can create a wonderfully private retreat with a beautifully framed view of the water. Another good measure of the health of your shoreline is the amount of wildlife you find there, whether it's birds, fish, mammals, amphibians, or insects. Wildlife will be attracted to areas where there's good habitat, and if you find lots of different wildlife on your shoreline, it's because you've created the good habitat for them. Conversely, if your shoreline has been predominantly cleared of vegetation, has lawn that extends right to the water's edge or to a beach area, or has been altered with a hardened structure like a retaining wall or gating baskets, or what we more commonly find in Muskoka, what I call loose rock walls, you're more likely to experience problems like shoreline erosion, poor water quality, or unwanted wildlife like Canada goose. And you also will find that you're likely going to be more impacted by extreme weather events like floods. Knowing how important naturally vegetated shorelines are to the health of our lakes and rivers helps us better understand the policies created by municipalities to support the protection of this critical shoreline environment. While each municipality may have different setback requirements in their policies, they do all include requirements for setbacks. The reason for these setbacks is not to make life more difficult for you, but rather it's to help ensure that sensitive shoreline areas are preserved in order to protect water quality. Without the good water quality we have in our lakes, we don't have much. The current Township Muskoka Lakes official plan, for example, requires setbacks of 15 meters and lists the following primary reasons: maintain a shoreline vegetative buffer, minimize the amount of impermeable surfaces, because as we heard a little bit earlier, the more hardened surfaces there are on your property, the more stormwater runoff is created that needs to be managed. And we don't want buildings and development to become the predominant features along shorelines. You also The purpose of the setback is also to maintain privacy and reduce noise pollution, especially on narrow water bodies. I think most of us on the webinar today recognize that sound carries very well over water. And if you don't have trees and other vegetation to help buffer that sound, it can be very distracting for a lot of people. We also want to maintain the aesthetic qualities of the waterfront and protect the natural habitat and minimize environmental impacts. However, none of these objectives will be reached if the setback area doesn't include significant amounts of natural vegetation. Setback areas should be considered no-touch zones with only limited shoreline access and use. For instance, where a path is proposed within the buffer or setback area, it should meander to the shoreline and be constructed of permeable material, like wood chips or gravel. And if stairs are used, which they should be if your property leading down to the water is on any sort of slope, they should be raised off the ground to allow growth beneath the structure. The principle of development in the vegetative buffer or setback area is to minimize disturbance of the ground, shrub, and canopy layers. I've only touched the very tip of the shoreline stewardship iceberg with this presentation. It may seem a bit overwhelming, but there are numerous resources available to help you become a better waterfront steward, including Muskoka Watershed Council's Living in Cottage Country Handbook, which has about 100 pages of good stewardship practices, predominantly for waterfront people to follow and help protect water quality. FOCA, the Federation of Ontario Cottage Association, has also produced a shorter, quick little booklet called A Shoreline Owner's Guide to Healthy Waterfronts. And it, again, hits the main points of what is important to try to protect the water around your lake or river. As well as there's programs to help with your renaturalization journey, things like the Natural Edge. And I believe Laura is going to be talking more about renaturalization and native plants and the importance of them. If you're wondering where to start, because there's a lot of information there. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to figure out what you're doing good and what maybe you can improve upon. But there are some places that can give you a starting point, including if you just want a very quick self-assessment, you can go to the Love Your Lake website, and they have an assessment that you can take. I believe it's only like 5 to 6 questions, and it gives you a good starting point at any rate. If you are looking for something a little more in-depth, then Watersheds Canada has produced the Lake Protection Workbook. It's free online as a PDF, or you can, I think for just a couple dollars, you can order a hard copy. But it does go through basically anything along your shoreline in a bit more detail, and gives you some really good advice on where you can improve upon. So I just wanted to give a quick rundown, and I'm hoping this presentation leads nicely into Laura's and Javier's. Thank you for listening. I like to finish off with this photo from the late Robert Allen, who I consider one of the pioneers of native plant landscaping in the Muskoka area. This picture, can you see yourself sitting on that bench, watching the sunset, listening to the frogs calling while birds flitter around in the branches above? And to me, this is what waterfront living should be. And I think this is what we should all aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Exactly what we needed to hear tonight. So that was terrific. The next speaker is Laura Thomas. So Laura, if you can come on screen and unmute yourself. Laura is the owner of Hidden Habitat, a native plant nursery that provides ecological landscaping and garden design services. Laura's worked in the landscape industry for over 15 years, blending her passion for conservation and landscape design, merging the elements of good landscape design with the practices of restoration ecology. So given her experience in ecology, native plants, and landscape design, she knew that one could still have the simplicity and impact of a modern garden while providing food and shelter for local wildlife. Her unique and thoughtful designs demonstrate healthy landscapes can be beautiful landscapes. So Laura, take it away. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here to talk about plants with everyone. So yeah, Rebecca's presentation was perfect kind of intro to why everyone needs to do it. So I'm just going to share my screen. And there we go. Okay, so I am, like Deb had mentioned, I own a native plant nursery. So I tend to talk a lot about native plants, and my background is a little bit like restoration ecology. So I like to blend the kind of the two worlds of horticulture or landscaping with conservation, because I feel like traditionally those two worlds have always kind of worked against each other rather than working with each other. So I guess my focus or my goal for this kind of presentation is to get people on board with naturalizing their shorelines with native plants, and that they don't have to be overly messy or wild. You kind of can have the best of both worlds. It can look intentional. It can be a garden through like very specific plant choices and design. So we'll get right into it. So essentially, a naturalized shoreline, although like Rebecca had mentioned, nature does like chaos and mess. But even if there's a part of your shoreline that you want it more naturalized, but perhaps it's close to like a seating area or something, and you want it to be a little bit more intentional looking, there are ways to achieve that. They also don't have to be heavily maintained. The plants are chosen appropriately. They shouldn't need soil amendments or watering once the plants are established. The only thing that has to happen, depending on people's preferences, is weeding, especially in the first year or so. Once the garden or space is established, weeding becomes less of a task as years goes by. So this here is a shoreline that we worked on for one of our customers a few years ago. So they actually came to us because they had a geese issue. The customer so they would come up the lawn area and kind of like do what geese do and poop everywhere. And they also saw it as a space that they wanted to sit in, and it was like a focal point. So they weren't too sure what to do. So there was like an entryway issue. So we created a shoreline garden. The photos were taken, I think, at a time when nothing was flowering, which is unfortunate because it's very beautiful garden in when kind of like midsummer when everything's well established now. This picture is from last spring, I believe. I think just maybe early summer. So we put a flagstone pathway in, and they did gate it to kind of stop the geese from coming in. And we've put rocks in as well as kind of like a further to further prevent or deter the geese from coming up. And also they noticed a lot of flooding issues and erosion. So we put those in to kind of help mitigate that. And so some considerations for if you want to put a garden, or when you're putting a garden in your shoreline. Often I get a lot of people that don't want to put stuff that's really tall, because line of sight, often depending on where they're sitting, if they're on their cottage patio, they still want to have a nice water view. So keeping stuff sometimes below 3 feet, access paths, and essentially keeping it wide. Essentially, the wider the depth or the bigger the buffer, the better, especially if one of your goals is geese abatement. And then also just to include plants that flower throughout all seasons. And I really like to include a blend of shrubs with herbaceous flowering perennials and grasses, especially to get a lot of structure in there. I find it helps, especially with soil erosion. It gives winter interest, and it can give it a little bit of height too, depending on if you want it. So some tips for success. So this is kind of rules for all gardens. It doesn't necessarily have to be for shoreline gardens, but that outer edge. So when you're coming more upland, if it's well defined, so whether that's through like a well cut edge, like, or if you are aligning it with, say, like a ground cover or small ornamental grass, it often does a lot to speak to the garden as being intentional. Always planting groupings, and wildlife actually prefer this too. So if you have like 1 or 2 milkweeds, they might not see it, so they're going to fly over. Whereas if you have a large grouping of, say, like 5 to 7 swamp milkweed in your garden, they're going to make that as they're going to see that as a place that they're going to want to stop. And it also just adds more of an impact to the garden. And one thing that people always often either forget or don't put in their gardens is grasses. And there's a lot of really wonderful shoreline grasses and rushes. I don't know if you can see it in the last. You can't. There's a lot of great rushes anyway that you can put in shoreline gardens that are just striking. They add so much interest and they're really beautiful. So there's a lot of options out there as well. These are some other kind of basic garden design tips that we always tell people. And so again, to planting groups, one that typically gets a lot of laughs is the mullet gardening. And that's just, you kind of have it tidier up front. So if that's like, you know, the waterfront area or the waterside area, and then it can be a little messier at the back. Also, we try to advocate that people don't rake the leaves up quite as much. It does a lot for soil health to leave the leaves. It does a lot for overwintering pollinators, insects, wildlife that are living in there. And again, a tidy border. And I feel like everyone's already pretty much on board with a lot of this, but to kind of ditch the pesticides and herbicides. And with native plants, there's no need for fertilizers, or you can just use organic compost if needed, but typically we don't do that either. We just plant plants that are appropriate for that location or the site conditions. So maintenance for any garden, for native plants, I sometimes always feel like it's easier if the gardener learns their weeds before knowing their plants, because typically in a garden you can say have 12 different types of perennials or shrubs that are coming up, where you often only will have like 3 or 4 different types of weeds. And that's usually grasses, dandelions, you might have creeping Charlie. Knowing what those look like, I find that makes it a lot easier than trying to figure out, you know, if something's a friend or a foe. Weeding in late spring is typically the most effective. That's because weeds are like exotic kind of invasives, and they get their burst of growth right before our natives do, especially the grasses. So you can get in there early. And again, I know I'm repeating myself, but you can leave the leaves as well. Act like mulch, so it can actually help with reducing weeds in the garden. So here is a list of some of the native plants that I often like to recommend putting in gardens. I believe they are kind of recording this for later. I have my contact information as well at the end of this slide. So people are welcome to kind of screen cap it if they want to save this. I can also send it to anyone else that's interested later. And these are some of the flowers and what they look like. And so, and a lot of these are really great at supporting pollinators. And I often get that request too, as to like what plants are going to benefit songbirds and pollinators. So this flower here, the cardinal flower, is a striking lobelia that's native to Muskoka shorelines already. It's not overly common, but if you paddle along the shorelines, you've probably seen it a few times. and it's really popular with a lot of our pollinators, specifically the hummingbirds. And same with turtlehead. That is often pollinated by bumblebees because they're the only ones that are actually big enough to kind of get into the flower. Often some of our smaller native bees and the honeybees aren't big enough to. And turtlehead actually has a medicinal benefit. It has like antimicrobial benefits for bumblebees. So when they're pollinating the flower, they're actually kind of getting a little bit of medicine. So you're kind of, it's a win-win. And then of course there's swamp milkweed, which a lot of people already know milkweed as being the host plant for the monarch caterpillar. And the rest here are just great kind of host plants, nectar plants and pollen plants for pollinators. And then as we know, when we attract kind of all those pollinators and other insects, you're also benefiting a lot of songbirds. And here we have some of our shrubs and trees. So meadowsweet is, I think it's all on the next slide as well. But I can go back because they're not all here. So a lot of them are our native viburnums. So wild raisin, nannyberry, arrowwood, which I didn't list here. We have a lot of native arrowwoods, hobblebush, which are fantastic. We have 2 native spireas, both native to Muskoka, the steeplebush and the meadowsweet, which are beautiful shoreline shrubs, and they're actually quite short. So they're perfect for plantings where people still don't want to impede any views. And I can go to the next slide so you can see what they look like. So steeplebush is this one, the bottom left, and its cousin or relative is the meadowsweet. And we have the native swamp rose as well, which is really beautiful. It's nice if you want to cover a large area, I find, because it does kind of ramble like that typical rose. And then nannyberry is nice for a little bit more upland. It tends to be quite big. It's almost like a small tree, so it can get upwards of 8 to 10 feet tall by wide. And then alternate leaf dogwood. I just put dogwood because alternate leaf didn't fit in the slide. And other benefits to including native plants in the garden. So we have some different pollinators, salamanders, the blue azure butterfly that you see here, the native spireas. So the meadowsweets and the steeplebush are host plants for this butterfly. This evening primrose is a host plant for the primrose moth, which is a beautiful little pink moth. And then obviously the monarch butterfly and some bumblebees. And often what I get from a lot of customers, especially ones planting along the shoreline, because that's such a important habitat wildlife, is that they do see that return of a lot of things, especially like reptiles, amphibians coming back. So I personally, I find that is a huge benefit to be able to kind of go in there and kind of see all that stuff. I feel like that's why we often live up here, is to have that connection with the wildlife that also call Muskoka home. In saying that, I do know and recognize that there is a lot of a conflict of relationship, I suppose, with some of our Canada geese. So a benefit, I think Rebecca touched on this as well, with kind of naturalizing the shoreline and creating a garden there, is that there is geese abatement. And so geese aren't going to come up if you're reducing their sight lines. So if they're not seeing the foraging area, so which is lawn usually, they're not going to be inclined to come up. Also, if you reduce access points, and they also, by putting a garden in, we often find that what we're replacing is lawn. So you're reducing the actual size of foraging areas. And this is kind of like another benefit to including native plants in our landscape. So one kind of statistic that I always am constantly surprised by is the fact that a mother or father chickadee, so when they're raising a clutch of fledglings in their nest, they will bring upwards of 400 to 600 chickadees, 400 to 600 caterpillars a day to that nest. So you can imagine how many caterpillars we need to support just one nest of chickadees. It's immense, and that's often is through trees. So I always say this, when it comes to shoreline gardening, it is great to include all the beautiful flowering perennials. But if you can include trees in the landscape, trees are definitely a keystone element to any habitat space, specifically willows and prunus species. So the wild cherries are great for supporting wildlife, and oaks. They actually support the most number of caterpillar species in North America. So I've included a few resources here. I just included resources for native plants. I know Rebecca from the Watershed Council, they're a fantastic resource, Muskoka Conservancy as well. And again, if people have any questions about plant selection, to help figure that out. And I know also, I don't think Rebecca mentioned this, but they do have a native plant program as well, the Natural Edge. So you can probably get a lot of information from their team as well, and have them come out to your shoreline and do consultations, you know, in addition to us. So hopefully I'll be able to inspire you to kind of grow a little wild. And I look forward to your questions later too.
Thank you, Laura. That was terrific. I used to do some consulting work that dealt with geese, and a little known fact that when a goose was eating grass, they pooped every 7 minutes. So it's you can have an awful lot of poop on a grass.
Yes.
So yeah, just keep that in mind. So we'll move along, and our next speaker is Javier Capella, and Javier is a registered professional forester and certified arborist, and is a member of the Muskoka Watershed Council as well. As a forester with West Wind Forest Stewardship, he manages crownland forests in Muskoka, and through Trees and Woodland Consulting, he provides rural and urban residents with arboriculture solutions to manage their trees to their full benefit. Javier is very passionate about sustainable development, promoting the value of trees around homes, and helping people see the forest for the trees. So welcome, Javier. He's going to be speaking about keeping the view from the canoe, healthy trees for our shoreline. So Javier, I'll ask you to unmute yourself, and you can share your screen and take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Deb. And thank you, Laura, for the shout out to trees. I appreciate it. They really are a critical component to our natural environment. Let me just set up my presentation. There we go. So hello, everyone. As Deb mentioned, my name is Javier, and I'm here to talk to you about keeping the view from the canoe, healthy trees on the shoreline. Or in my case, since we don't have a canoe, the SUP, the stand-up paddleboard. I'm very fortunate to have married into a family that has a cottage on Golden Beach on Lake Muskoka, so very thankful for that. And there also happens to be a SUP there as well. So a little bit about myself. So I have a consulting business that's called Trees and Woodlands Consulting, where we do arboriculture and forest project management. I'm a professional forester, registered with the Ontario Professional Forest Association, and I'm also an ISA certified arborist. That's the International Society of Arboriculture. And so let's get right down to it and talk about the trees on the shoreline. And I love this photo. I took this photo just north of Muskoka, and that's in the fall when the larch or the tamarack is turning a golden color before it loses its needles. and there just happened to be by chance one larch in and amongst pine and spruce and balsam fir trees along the shoreline. And it looks very rural, very rugged, very natural, but in fact there are cottages just left of that golden tamarack, and then to the right of it as well. There are cottages there on this lake. So just an example of what those natural environments can look like with cottages on them. So first I'd like to talk about the values of trees on the shoreline. And there's a whole host of values that we need to discuss. And first of all, the environmental values, and I think that Rebecca and Laura as well covered off those values very, very well. So environmentally, the shoreline is more than likely the more biodiverse location on your property in Muskoka. Unless you have a swamp or a marsh on your property, that shoreline area is the most biologically diverse, even if you have a manicured land, because that soil is likely richer and the aquatic environment right up to your manicured property has a lot of aquatic biodiversity there as well. So there's lots of value environmentally to that shoreline. And I couldn't help myself but go onto Realtor and see what the price of real estate was in Muskoka on the shoreline recently. So that's where I found some of these next couple of photos. And other values that we need to talk about that sometimes are forgotten are the social, cultural, and recreational values, because those are part and parcel of that shoreline. And there's no sense in talking about the natural environment and the value that it provides us if we don't also think about the cultural and the recreational value that those shorelines give us. And to a lot of people that are in family cottages or they've inherited these shorelines, there's a lot of heritage, there's a lot of history associated with these properties and these shorelines, and it's important to recognize that, especially when we're thinking about work on our trees or construction projects on our property. And finally, of course, there's the economic and the financial value that our shoreline provides us. And this is critical because it can really add or take away from not only our experience, but also to the value that our property has on the market, and also to our family and to the next generations that will inherit the properties that we have in Muskoka on the shoreline. So having talked about values, I'd like to talk about trees. And rather than showing you images of trees in all sorts of shoreline settings, I wanted to take the little time I have here and talk about tree risk assessment. And that's what we're talking about when we think about doing some tree care on our property. We're talking about tree risk assessment. In order to understand risk, we need to, when it comes to trees, we need to think about those values. And we use things such as the tree risk hazard evaluation form if you're a certified arborist. And these forms have very detailed information about the condition of a tree and the different decays that it might have and the types of work that might be required on a tree. But none of this is important unless you consider the values of a homeowner. And sometimes that's forgotten because we can have situations where we're in a panic, or there's very little time, or there's a property manager or a family member that's dealing with it, and the values are forgotten or misplaced or just not thought of. So it's important to think about the values because it actually ties right into how we assess the risk of a tree. And if we want to manage the trees on our shoreline, or we think we need to manage the trees on our shoreline, we need to think about the hazard rating of those trees. And that little rectangle on the top left here gives you an equation that a certified arborist can provide, where they assess the potential of failure of either part of the tree or all of the tree, assess it with relationship to what part of that tree might fail, and what will it hit? What will it physically hit? Will it hit your dock? Will it hit your boathouse? Will it come crashing on your lawn, or will it come crashing on a part of your property that nobody goes to and that nobody ever goes to? So those are things to remember. Targets are important and they're part of the risk assessment. And if there is no target, perhaps the work that needs to be done is significantly less, which would cost you less, or perhaps we can let that tree decay on site and like Laura mentioned, provide a lot of the environmental values that a dying tree might provide, so long as it's safe for us to when we're using the property. So that's where this tree risk assessment comes in place. It might seem like it's removed from our recreational use of the property or the environmental values of the property, but it's actually part and parcel of it. We need to consider how we use the property and how those trees impact us on the property before we should make a decision on whether to remove a tree, to prune a tree, or to do any other type of work related to trees. So that really comes down to assessing priorities in tree care. And I like to make the analogy that assessing priorities in tree care is a lot like taking your car into the mechanic. And if we have a good mechanic, a certified mechanic, just like a ISA certified arborist, they'll be able to tell you the work that needs to be done right now, which for most people is pretty obvious. You might hear that weird sound coming out of your vehicle. And when it comes to trees, if you have a large maple or a willow come crashing down on your driveway or over your dock, yes, you're probably going to want to have that cleaned up. So some of that stuff is pretty self-explanatory, but there's also other aspects of tree care that isn't quite so black and white. It's a little bit more gray. And that's where a tree risk assessment comes in very handy. So the photo on the left, you have a tree with a dead top, and then there's lots of trees in the understory around it. And the photo on the right, you have another tree with a bunch of dead branches lower down as that canopy on that tree has been raising above to try to get some sunlight. And those branches have been dying progressively. How big are those branches and where is that tree located is important. So for both situations, there are dead components to that tree, and there certainly is a risk of part or all of that tree coming down respectively. But what are the targets? Is it going to hit a structure? Is it going to land in an area that you use? Is it going to land in an area where nobody goes? And also something that people might not consider, generationally, cottages are used differently. So for the last 20 years, perhaps there's been adult children and there hasn't been a lot of kids playing around. But all of a sudden, that area of the shoreline or that area of the property has more people on it and children out running through it. So perhaps now, because of the type of people that are on the property, there is actually a target and it is worth considering some tree care. But for the last few years, perhaps that wasn't the case. So things aren't consistent and they will change and they're dynamic, and part of making those priorities in tree care allow you to make that assessment. And finally, there are some things that are nice to do, maybe. So there's a great article in Cottage Life, how do you deal with a tree that's fallen into the lake? And there's nothing more valuable to a shoreline as far as trees are concerned than that woody debris that lands into the lake, environmentally speaking. So if we have a large willow, for example, like in this photo, that's come crashing down on the shoreline, if it's not anywhere near your dock, if it's nowhere near your swimming area, if it doesn't interfere with your boating or your access, perhaps you can leave it in the lake. It's adding woody debris to the aquatic environment. It's providing carbon and nutrients into that shoreline aquatic environment. It's providing habitat, it's providing shade. There's so many values that that individual tree that's fallen into your lake provides. But at the same time, that's only one value. And the environmental value arguably should be an important consideration, but we need to consider the practical use of the land and the recreational use of the land as well. So perhaps it needs to be removed, or perhaps we can remove part of the tree and leave the stump, or if we cut the tree down and move the bulk of that tree, the stem, and just place it on the shoreline, it'll still provide some value to that aquatic ecosystem, but it will no longer be in the way. So it doesn't have to be cut and dry, get rid of the tree or keep the tree. There are so many creative ways that we can manage trees on our landscape to meet a whole host of values that we have for our shoreline properties. And now this slide is where I'm gonna get just a little bit technical with you and talk about what is the greatest risk to the view from the canoe when it comes to our shoreline trees. And in order to talk about that, I need to first show you this little graphic of what a tree looks like and where the roots are. And many people don't realize that over 50% of a tree's biomass is actually below ground. So as much of a tree that we see above ground, in the canopy and in the main stem and in those large branches, an equal amount of that tree is below ground in the roots. But unlike in some very nice images that we might draw, tree roots don't grow the way that the canopy grows above ground. They actually stay within the first 30 centimeters of the soil, which, if you think, makes a lot of sense to stay close to where the moisture and the most nutritious soil is located. There's only a few roots that go deep into the soil, and those will anchor the tree depending on the species. But the majority of the roots of the tree, which means the majority of that 50% of the tree's biomass, is actually within 30 centimeters of the surface of the soil. And that's not a very deep area. And on top of that, the majority of those roots lie within the canopy of the trees and in what's known as the drip line. So the area of the soil that has the greatest amount of roots for a tree are under the canopy, 30 centimeters from the surface of the soil and within the drip line of that tree. And the drip line just means if you were to drop a drop of water onto the top of the tree and the tree didn't take the water in through the canopy at all and it came off the edge, it would be where that water falls on the very edge of the canopy, and that creates our drip line. So that area is known as the tree or root protection zone. And large municipalities have understood this, and they have requirements for putting up fences. In larger municipalities, it can be very expensive fences made out of 2x4s or plywood, but it doesn't have to be. As long as there's some sort of mechanism, whether it's flagging tape or a line or maybe some snow fencing, something just to delineate this area when we're doing work around a tree and protect that area of the tree. Because the greatest risk to the tree from the shoreline, for our view from the shoreline, is when we're thinking about renovations and we're thinking about construction projects. The single greatest risk is the digger. When we bring equipment onto the site, when we bring equipment to do some improvements to our property, and there's no thought given to where that equipment is going or how close it's getting to the trees that are intended to stay on the property, then we can have some real damage to the tree. And this image really shows how some fencing was put up just to protect to section off an area, but not to get in any consideration to the root zone of that tree. So you can see the soil around this large maple tree that has been, part of the soil has been removed, but also the machinery has compacted that soil. And once we compact that soil is also half air, half mineral soil with water in it. And so when we put heavy equipment onto that soil, we compact it, we lose those air pockets, and we either crush or drown or starve out those roots. So it's pretty much a terrible situation when it comes to the tree's roots to have heavy equipment in and around trees that we plan to keep. And the second greatest risk when it comes to the view from the shoreline for our trees is still with renovations and construction. And it's not making that consideration for what we're doing when we have contractors on site and we're doing this work. Where are we staging the material? How are we accessing the site? Have we put up those protection barriers that I talked about to protect that critical root zone under the canopy of a tree? And is the contractor taking the opportunity to park their vehicles under the shade of a tree in order to have lunch there, or just to keep the vehicle cool so that it's a reasonable place to have a rest on a very hot day? So perfectly reasonable thing to do. And the other things that one might not consider, but if we have someone on site that is aware of what those trees need and what the roots of those trees need, you'd be able to prevent this damage and ensure that those trees are healthy into the future once the construction is completed. And of course, the image on the far right, I'm showing just digging up where a tree was planted, and it still has its burlap bag tied around the tree with the yarn tied to it. And so poorly planting new trees onto the site isn't going to help that shoreline environment that we're creating in construction projects. So all this comes down to arboriculture project management, and is it worth it? Well, trees raise the value of any residential property as much as $19,000. And on a seasonal property or cottage in Muskoka, as with anywhere else, trees on a property can raise the market value by 7 to 20%, as well as reducing your air conditioning costs and reducing your heating costs. Mature trees and smaller trees really add to the lifestyle that you have on your property. And in some cases, we don't even realize it. We take it for granted. They've been there forever. They've been there the whole time you've been at the cottage or on the property. And it's not what you're thinking about when you're thinking about putting in the new dock or putting in the new boathouse or adding an addition to the boathouse or building a bunkie or having someone come in and build a bunkie, such a small structure. But if they bring in that digger and they bring in the trucks and they park them under the trees and there's no thought given to where the material is going to be laid and how the work is going to be undertaken, we may be damaging some of that natural legacy that we have on the site. So some questions to ask yourself as you're planning your next renovation or construction project when it comes to trees. Is the property manager, if you have one, aware of how to protect the trees and their roots? Have you had an ISA certified arborist come on site to do the work? And there's lots of people with chainsaws and pickup trucks, which can do a great job in removing a hazard tree or a tree that needs to come down. But when it comes to taking care of trees, pruning them, maybe raising the canopy, removing dead branches, making sure it's safe to have this tree on the property even and extend its life just a bit longer. That kind of work really requires an ISA certified arborist to be on site while it's being undertaken. And when doing construction projects, has the general contractor thought about trees on the site when they're planning the job? Have they thought about how they're accessing the site? Have they given any thought to the roots of the trees and where they're located and where that critical root zone is located? And at the end of the day, who is speaking for the trees on your property? Because if it's not a general contractor and the homeowner is not able to, then it's probably a good idea to bring in somebody to consider to manage that project from an arboriculture context. So finally, that's what we do at Trees and Woodlands Consulting. We provide you with a full service of opportunities to manage the trees and the forests on your property to make sure that your values are met and that we can enhance the lifestyle that you have on your property. And in many instances, it's not black or white. It's not we can't have the tree there or we can. Sometimes we can, in many cases, we can work with contractors, work with the designers or the architects, and work with property managers or any trades to make sure that there are concessions made, but at the end of the day, you have those values on the property, whether it's environmental, recreational, and of course the economic values that we want from our properties. So yes, we offer tree care and services as well as assistance in project management in construction as well. And so with that, I want to say thank you very much. Thank you to our hosts and to the other panelists, and my contact information is here on the right. And I leave you with this wonderful image, which is being able to see the forest for the trees. We have a lovely nurse log, white pine nurse log on the right, nursing a yellow birch as it's growing up onto it in a lovely yellow birch stand forest. So couldn't help but throw that in there at the end. Thank you.
That's a great picture, Javier. Thank you so much for your presentation. And you articulated a few things that I've been thinking about. I have a granddaughter now, and I was thinking about branches falling on her, and I had some trees trimmed just for that reason. And so the generational use, I think, was a really important point. So at this point, we're going to take some questions, and I'm going to ask all our panelists to turn their mics on and turn their cameras on. so that we can get down to some. I'm just going to start us off because Laura's comment about the chickadees eating the caterpillars reminded me of how I spent a bit of my Sunday last week was picking off the gypsy moth, now known as the LDD moth, caterpillars off my oak trees. And I'm going to say right now, I drowned them in a bucket of soapy water, but I probably should have been looking for a chickadee to come and eat them from me. But,
I don't know
my
if
hand,
they eat them.
Well, I hope they do,
I don't-
because there's going to be a lot of them. But
Yeah,
have
that's
your,
one of the things I kept thinking.
No, go ahead. Yep, keep going.
I just keep meaning to look it up. I don't know.
Well, maybe we'll find out. We'll watch for that. So I'm just wondering, Javier, if you could make any comment about what's happening with the moths and how it will affect our trees going forward in the for the next year or two, because I gather it's not a single year cycle. So.
Sure, yes. Well, I mean, gypsy moths are not native, but they do have a cyclical nature now in Ontario. And probably 7 to 10 years is generally that we'll see the worst of it. So we're probably into it now. And if I share my screen for a second, I found a great resource on the MNR website.
Sure.
And they have a great infographic of what you can do at the different stages. So right now we're into mid-May and into June. So if you want to manage those gypsy moth caterpillars on your property, late stage caterpillars is where we're at now. So if you take some burlap bags and wrap them around your trees on the main stem of the tree, just off the ground, like a meter or so off the ground, you can prevent them from climbing up into the tree. And then that will only work for a little while. Then once we get into June to July, you'll have pupa throughout. And so you can, if you feel up to it, you can remove those by hand, or you can use a fly swatter, or maybe even a pressure washer and knock them off the trees or the siding or wherever they happen to be. And the burlap bag though right now is a great option because it won't damage the tree. It'll let the bark breathe, and it'll stop the caterpillars from climbing that tree if they haven't already done so.
Great, thanks for that. One of the things that I think we're seeing a lot of on the shoreline is where some of the best lots have been taken for years, and so some of the harder to develop lots are now becoming popular. And if you bought it in the middle of the winter, you might not have ever noticed that you were buying against a wetland or in a very weedy shoreline. And maybe Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind commenting on the unique challenges of having a cottage on a wetland shoreline or a shallow weedy shoreline, and what maybe needs to be thought about as people use it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly wetlands are kind of we don't have a lot, and we're lucky that we still have most of what we naturally do. In Southern Ontario, they've lost the majority of the wetlands. So we're lucky to have what we do have. And I think, I know flooding is a big issue, a big concern for many of the people on the call, on the webinar today. And, even the very small, depression on our property that does collect water and favors wetland species, that's very important for helping to moderate the flow of water off a property and during flooding. So, I think it's important for people to realize where those sort of depressions are and protect them, as opposed to just filling them in and trying to make a very smooth lawn area or property. And I mean, wetlands do offer a lot of nice recreation opportunities, the wildlife viewing and stuff. So, if you do, trying to enjoy your wetland, you could set up, a little raised platform out over the wetland to try to see what's there, maybe a little boardwalk going through that's raised up so that you're not going to impact the species in the wetland. But, I think we need to stop thinking of wetlands and wet areas as unusable, waste areas, and really start to appreciate them for the valuable benefits they do provide us, not just around flood control, but, a well-functioning wetland will help will help moderate, you know, mosquitoes and black flies and stuff, because they support a lot of the species that will feed on those. So, you know, I think it's time to sort of enjoy our wetlands and give them the buffer, right? Same as your shoreline, you want to have a buffer area around them. So what you're doing on your property isn't going to impact your wetland, but I definitely think we kind of need a little bit of a change in mind around wetlands and really start to appreciate them for what they do for us, and instead of thinking of them as a waste.
One of our participants has just put in the chat that I think it's time that we started to see the beauty in wetlands, and I totally agree, Catherine. Thanks. I think the other part that with wetlands is also to recognize that propellers from boats rip up the vegetation, and they also stir up the sediment. And as it stirs up the sediment, it prevents the other plants from growing. And of course, if you've got your prop all covered in vegetation, I'm sure a few of us have had that in our times on the lakes. But that eventually damages the wetland further. And I think, you know, there's a great example of that in the Indian River just south of Port Carling, where the entrance to the grocery store was cut through the wetlands, and people put their boats through there, and the wetland has actually declined significantly in the years that since that's happened. So we do need to be thinking about them in a different way. I agree. So we've got a few questions in the chat box, or in the question and answer box. So one for you, Laura. Will milkweed do well in a very wet area?
It depends on the milkweed. So in Ontario, we have 3 or 4 species of milkweed. So the one that'll do really well in a wet area is swamp milkweed. So it looks similar to the common milkweed that you find everywhere along the roadsides. It's just a darker pink, and it's a little taller. So it typically can get like 4, almost upwards of 5 feet sometimes. It's beautiful. Still supports the caterpillars. And I find, like, we have a wet meadow on our property, and we have common milkweed that grows there as well, along with Joe Pye weed. So common milkweed's pretty tolerant to wet conditions too.
Wet and dry, yeah. Great. Rebecca, is it possible for a resident to request a shoreline audit or analysis of property, I guess through the, what's the program, sorry, Natural
Edge program.
Natural Edge program, yes.
Yeah, if you go onto the Watershed Council website, there's a page there for the Natural Edge, and there's a form that you can fill in to request a site visit. I will say this year we've had great success with the program, and right now we're working on a wait list to book sites in the last part of summer. We've kind of booked up the first part of summer, and then we've got a wait list starting. So if you just go on, fill in the form, we'll get added to a wait list, and then I'll contact you probably in about a month and set up a date for a site visit, but definitely available.
Oh, great. That's terrific. Javier, if mature trees, say white pines, are clear cut on a property, how many years is it going to take to get a replacement tree to be providing at least the same sort of view and maturity?
Yes, well, I mean, if you have a mature white pine that's 30 or more feet, or 30, 40 feet tall, or bigger, and you're planting a new white pine tree that's even 4 or 5 feet tall, you can probably hope that within the next 125 to 150 years, you can have the same size tree back on the site. White pine are definitely a legacy tree, and arguably there were far more white pine in Muskoka than there are today, if we're talking 100 to 200 years ago, especially pre-European settlement. And so the forest is still here, but the composition of the forest has certainly changed, and we have more hardwood trees. So what we can do to protect the existing mature trees we have on a property today is better than planting new trees. And not to say that planting new trees isn't a good idea, but in many cases we can do a lot more to protect what we have than maybe people realize, and for a very cost-effective method, especially when you think of the value of properties in Muskoka and the cost of any sort of work that we do. It's very inexpensive and very efficient to protect the trees and the natural environment that we have on the site today.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good reminder. 125 years later, we'll have a big tree. There's a question here about, I'd love to have a shrub and flower garden, but the deer are a big issue. Anybody want to weigh in on how we can have our gardens and our deer too?
I can drop into that. I get a lot of people, especially on islands and shoreline gardens. Yeah, beavers and deer, I should say. So I will say there's a caveat with all wildlife browsing is that if they're hungry, they will go for anything. So if you see online or if you see at a garden center deer resistant, like black-eyed Susans, for example, and typically most milkweeds are sold as being deer resistant. But I've seen several cases of the deer just nipping either the new foliage coming up, like the new buds, or like the flower buds. So they'll kind of graze on almost anything. So in saying that, they really prefer not to eat like fuzzy plants. So black-eyed Susans, like I said, foam flower is another one that's a little hairy. Boneset is another one that's really furry.
Foxglove has been one, isn't it? That they don't eat?
Yeah, so it's a European plant though. So foxglove is European, and yeah, it's got a chemical in it that I can't remember, but we do, confusingly enough, have a native penstemon that is called foxglove beard tongue. And it's heavily grazed by deer though. They really like it. It's got really fleshy foliage. Yeah, if that person wants to reach out to me, they can email me and I can send them over like a quick list. And then same with beavers, they will almost chew down any tree, as I'm sure Javier, like we had a customer, we put in a white pine for them and the beavers still chewed through it. So.
Oh. Well, that's part of living with nature a bit. I do have a little hack I use, which is I beat up one egg in a cup of water and I filter it and I spray it on the plants, and that has really cut down the deer coming to the property and chewing away on my flowers. And it seems to last. And I think they got the hint, so they just stopped coming after a while and probably went to my neighbors, which is okay if they're not using it, right? So. Good. So let's see here. I'm just going through so there's a comment about rocks on the shoreline that are not beneficial and why they're a bad versus good thing. And then also, and a sort of some separate question, but in the same vein, is if one was adding rocks to the shoreline, which Laura was showing us an example of, and Rebecca was showing us examples of that kind of need to stabilize the shoreline. I'm assuming there's permits that are required for that. So maybe Rebecca, you could just maybe expand on that, and whether Laura, you want to talk a bit about permitting and that sort of thing. But
sure. The good rule of thumb is anytime you want to do anything along your shoreline below the high water mark, always find out whether you need to get permits or not. Sometimes it's more of a self-regulated process, but sometimes you do need permits. So I suggest anytime you're thinking of doing anything below the high water mark to look into it and make sure you don't need the permits to do what you want to do. In terms of rocks, yeah, so I did mention in my talk that we don't have gabion retaining walls or riprap as much as you might find in maybe Eastern Ontario cottage country. But what we do find more in Muskoka is what I call a loose rock wall. And it's kind of a lower impact way of trying to protect the shoreline. And it's one of my ones that it's an easier way to soften that impact. Having a straight rock wall, whether it's loose rock or gabion basket, it impedes the wildlife access from the lake to the shoreline and vice versa. And it doesn't necessarily resolve your erosion issues. So in severe cases, along some river areas where you do get a lot of erosion, I think a combination, right? Like you can have some of the rocks to help hold soil down, but interspersed among the loose rocks, you can plant some native plants that'll help grow, and the roots will help bind the soil. So I think there is certainly a way to soften some of the shoreline, or some of the hardened shorelines in our area, and encourage wildlife habitat and prevent shoreline erosion.
Laura, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I pretty much the same as Rebecca. I know in the image that I showed before, it showed like the line of rocks. We did interplant rushes and ferns to soften it. And a lot of that was for aesthetic, because they didn't want a harsh wall of rock as well. Yeah, I mean, a soft edge is always going to be better than a hard edge when it comes to shorelines, for sure. The one garden that I did show you was a bit of a compromise, because the customer wanted primarily we're more interested in geese abatement. That was their primary goal. And so that's why the rocks were kind of brought in as well, and then to soften it. And they also didn't want a large buffer. So I think the width of the garden was probably like 2 meters or so. And recognizing that that's probably still not wide enough with low-lying perennials to deter them. So it was kind of like one added thing. But I find like in these instances, it's like you always have to make a bit of compromise sometimes, depending on what the end goal is. Ideally, if it's just purely to naturalize shoreline, then plant trees and yeah, go plant trees.
There's another question here, is sort of a similar on the same vein, is that with boat waves and, especially the waves are getting bigger, and especially there's a lot more activity with wake boats. And so the damage to shorelines can occur. And if we just have, a lot of us have rocky shorelines, but if they're lower lying and the vegetation alone isn't enough to probably stem that erosion and damage the shoreline. So is there any sort of advice you might give on that front?
Well, when it comes to
Go ahead. Oh. Oh, we lost him. Somebody else want to go in and while we wait for Javier? Yeah. Are you back? Okay. You want to answer, Javier?
Sorry. Yes, sorry. When it comes to the shoreline, anything we can do to maintain some of that woody vegetation just helps to retain the shoreline itself. So the root mass of those trees is what's going to hold back that shoreline initially. And of course, if it's significant damage, then we need to consider something else. But like I said earlier, there's a whole amount of wood that's in the ground as roots. And so if we can just appreciate those roots, they will retain that soil and hold it for our shorelines.
So to keep the if you have to take a tree down, or if it dies, don't take the roots out, leave them in there anyway. That would be helpful, right?
Oh yes, I mean you can have the stump and have the stump rot away, but while the stump is rotting away, those roots are still there, and the roots themselves will rot and they will decompose and they'll add to the soil. So it's all very valuable to the environment, but at the same time providing some of that structure. Okay. And that's where, if you've had that large white pine taken down for whatever reason, or it's fallen down, if we leave the stump, then the roots of that tree are still providing that retention for the shoreline. And if you go ahead and plant more white pine or maybe sugar maple or other species on the site, no, they won't be as big as the white pine anytime soon, but those roots will work to hold that shoreline in place as well.
Good.
And just quickly to add to that, I also think like aquatic vegetation often gets a bad rap as well, but a healthy amount of aquatic vegetation in the water, naturally occurring aquatic vegetation in the water, does help to buffer waves and wake action against your shoreline. Same with the down woody debris, rocks and boulders that are naturally found along the shoreline. The more you can resist the urge to clean up these areas, the more it'll be protected against wave and wake action. So it'll all
Good plan. We got time for a couple more questions before we have to leave. So a quick one, I think, should you mow the lawn on the tile bed or let the weeds and the wildflowers grow? Any comments?
I'll go.
Not
or
the trees,
Lauren,
I know
go.
that. All right, who's gonna go, Rebecca or Laura?
I'll let Rebecca take it. She probably has a better answer.
Generally speaking, as long as it's not woody vegetation, then it's great to have, I think it's greater to have larger plants and allow them to grow up more so that it does have a bit of the roots do have the ability to grow a little bit. Not everyone wants to let their tile bed go crazy. So certainly I know some people who allow things to grow up and then just mow it down once a season, and that'll help prevent woody vegetation from establishing on your tile bed. But yeah, I mean, it's a great place to have a wildflower meadow if you want, or the important thing is to have vegetation on there. You definitely need vegetation, but it can't be woody vegetation.
All right, good. There's some, I think there's a lot of concern these days with a lot of and we've talked about it a little bit with what Javier was speaking about, is the lot of clear cutting of properties, is that not trying to work around the trees. And I know that there is a significant amount of policy work going on. The Township of Muskoka Lakes has their official plan policy happening. So what would you say, or how do you feel that we should be contributing to that conversation about protecting the shoreline and protecting the trees? Do you have any thoughts on maybe from the Watershed Council's perspective about contributing to that conversation?
Well, we, as the Watershed Council, we do produce resources to help educate. Our big thing is education, right? We're not a regulatory body in any sense of the word, but we do try to educate. So whether that's municipal councilors, so that they are can make better decisions around land use, or if it's the public, when it comes time for things like official plans, we always encourage people to get involved in official plan reviews, because that's where the vision for the municipality is being brought forward. And that's where people need to make sure that vision includes what they want it to have. So the more people who are viewing shorelines as important, the more support there is for councilors and municipalities to incorporate that information into official plans. So I think the more people get involved is very important. And, education, things like this, right? Like these webinars, getting people interested and looking at it. But we're a volunteer-based organization, so it is hard for us to comment on a lot of things, especially with, in Muskoka and our watershed municipalities. There's 9 municipalities in there involved. So, and each of them have to do an official plan review every 5 to 10 years. So it's a lot of work, but what we try to do is develop, we want to see similar policies in all the official plans, right? So we try to develop resources that kind of talk about what we'd like to see included in all the official plans. And then that can be used when each individual municipalities are
when the time comes.
Exactly.
Laura,
I'd like to add too,
sorry, go ahead, Javier. Yep.
Oh, sorry, Deb. Yeah, I just want to add as well. I mean, education, like Rebecca said, is key. And not only landowners and the people on this webinar that are obviously interested in the natural environment around the shoreline, but realtors. If people just appreciated the value that trees and natural environments add to the value of that property. I mean, already, obviously, Muskoka has very large property values, but on a case-by-case basis, they can be that much larger. 7 to 20% is not a small number, especially when you're looking at the value of properties in Muskoka. So it is true economic value that these trees and shrubs and wetland environments around our properties add to us.
And we have a choice of protecting that value. So last question, I'm going to send it over to Laura. And this one is hot on my list too. You mentioned not raking the leaves because they're obviously good for mulching, but what about pine and hemlock needles? That's what I have most of. Should we leave them or should we take them away?
Leave them. So they're just like leaves, they just look different. So they do take longer to decompose, like because they're just like thicker. But one thing I will say, often I get people like crazily raking up all their pine needles because they think it's going to make their garden or their water or their beach acidic. Like it's going to change the acidity of their soil or the water, and that's a misconception. Pine needles or any sort of conifer isn't any more acidic than a oak leaf or a maple. They just so happen to often grow in acidic soil, so it's more of a relation of correlation than causation. We've actually have a few customers that mulch with pine needles in their garden beds because that's what they have. And it eventually decomposes to make really lovely soil.
Well, that's good to hear because I got lots of them. And I keep telling my husband not to rake the forest, and so I'm gonna show him this part of the video. So, well, that's all the time we have for tonight, and I want to thank all of you for preparing for us for tonight, the great presentations and participating and being good sport answering all the questions. We do have some questions we didn't get to, so we will be trying to answer them. I think maybe some of them have been answered on the chat box as well, or in the Q&A box, and you're welcome to try and answer those. I think there's one there for you, Javier, about pine trees, if you feel like answering that one. And we will have some resources posted on the MLA website. And I would just want to say for a moment that this event is brought to you by the Muskoka Lakes Association, and we are the oldest lake association in Canada, serving our waterfront landowners since 1894. The Muskoka Lakes Association's mission is to promote the responsible use, enjoyment, and conservation of the unique Muskoka environment. And we tend to concentrate on protecting water quality, advocating for responsible land use and government, promoting responsible land use and leading on potentially important Muskoka issues. So if you're a member, thank you for continuing to support us in the work that we do. And if any of you are on the line who aren't members, I ask you, what's stopping you? You can do more of these things with us. One thing to do before you leave, we have a few polls, the last 3 polls on the screen, and I would ask if you'd fill that out for us so that we can guide our future efforts in this regard. We will be posting the webinar onto the MLA website. That will be a couple of days in time to get it downloaded and put up. And then we'll follow up and put some of the answers to the questions on the website as well. So please finish filling out the poll. Thank you again to our speakers. You were terrific. And I will say thank you for attending tonight. Be good to your neighbors and to your trees and your plants and the wildlife on your shoreline. And good night.